A 2-hour calming historical journey exploring forgotten rituals, unknown lives, and boring but vital moments in history, one quiet detail at a time. You awaken slowly in the dim glow of twilight, not by candlelight, but by sound. Not just any sound, but a pattern, deep, low, persistent. It's not a drumbeat in celebration, nor the thundering call of war. It is slower, more methodical, as if language itself were being pounded into the air. You are hearing the gong, the talking drum. In the lush and transitional savannas of what is today southwestern Nigeria, the Oyo Empire flourished between the 14th and 19th centuries. What defined Oyo wasn't merely its military prowess or trade dominance, but something far more subtle, its sonic infrastructure. The empire ran not just on manpower and commerce, but on the beat of a complex language of drums. The talking drums, particularly the gong and dundun, were more than musical instruments. They were a bureaucratic necessity, a political tool, and a cultural archive. Imagine this: a message from the Alifin, the emperor, had to reach a province 120 miles away. There were no postal services, no written orders for most people. Instead, trained drummers would convey full phrases, coded idioms, and even names through the tonal mimicry of Yoruba, a language deeply dependent on pitch. The drums could speak with remarkable accuracy. But the real marvel wasn't the technology. It was the ritualized system that governed the way this information moved. Just like how mail is sorted in depots today, the Oyo Empire had checkpoints, signal relay points, and a drum-based hierarchy for messages. Drummers in Oyo weren't mere performers. They were members of the Ayan lineage, a hereditary caste charged with remembering and communicating history, praise poetry, and state affairs. Each royal drummer held the status of a court official. They had training that began in early childhood, with boys learning how to match the vocal tones of Yoruba speech with the tension-adjustable leather cords of the gong. These drummers were essentially living archives. Oral record keepers who could recount 5, 10, or even 20 generations of lineage through complex praise songs. In this way, the drummers were the memory of the state, performing a dual role: entertainers in festivals and code-bearers in moments of governance. When drums spoke, people listened and understood. The use of talking drums was not spontaneous or improvisational. Every performance followed a ritual. Drumming messages had to obey protocols: the morning drum to greet the sunrise, the evening farewell, and the highly structured oro message drums that announced royal decrees or death. You could not simply play a message without invoking the ancestors. Drummers often began with a coded praise of previous rulers or gods, setting the spiritual stage before delivering their news. Even the drum itself was sacred. Crafted from a single log of carved wood and covered with animal hide, the gong was often blessed and buried for days before its first use. The wood had to be chosen carefully, neither too soft nor too resonant, lest the drum distort the linguistic tones. The drum became a living object, passed down through generations, sometimes even given names. If the drummer died, the drum was often buried with him. This wasn't just governance. It was ritual governance, where bureaucracy was sacred and the mundane act of message transmission became a performance of divine order. The Oyo Empire's sprawling territory required fast, reliable communication, especially in times of political upheaval. A rebellion in the northern regions, or an overdue tax from a vassal state, could destabilize trade routes or anger the Alifin. Enter the whisper network, not of spies, but of drummers. There were strategically placed villages where message drumming towers, sometimes just tall wooden platforms, allowed drummers to relay signals across tens of miles. A simple message like, "The Alifin summons the Baal of Ibarapa to Oyo," could be transmitted in under an hour through a chain of drummers. There were coded idioms and formulaic phrases, not unlike government jargon today, to maintain consistency and avoid ambiguity. For example, the phrase for royal summons could be wrapped in layers of praise to the king and respectful metaphors to ensure proper delivery. But mistakes happened. A wrongly played tone could shift meaning from summon to punish. Thus, drummers trained for decades to avoid such catastrophic errors. What, then, did daily life sound like under this empire of drums? To an outsider, the drumming may have sounded festive or random. But to an Oyo citizen, the air was dense with information. In markets, petty traders would echo drum rhythms, either by humming them or mimicking them through verbal chants. Children played drum language games. Even court proceedings could be rhythmically summarized and passed down. At royal ceremonies, drum language was law. If a drum declared a change in leadership, it was understood as final. There was no room for rebuttal. It was said that a message delivered by drum, if approved by the court, had the authority of inked decree. But what happens when the drums fall silent? As trade routes shifted and the Oyo Empire began to fragment in the 19th century, the ritual drumlines fell into disuse. Some were destroyed, others were lost. Oral transmission faded as colonial powers replaced the sacred rhythms with written bureaucracy. Yet fragments remain. A few families still teach the art. Some drums still sit in dusty corners of Yoruba villages. They are old, cracked, forgotten, yet silently waiting for someone to hear them again. And so we are left to wonder, if drums once spoke empires into existence, what might they say now, if we truly listened? In the stillness of night, long after the sun surrendered to the horizon, a distant tremor of rhythm passed over the savannah. Not thunder, not hooves, but words, encoded, ancient, weighty, sent across the earth by drum. You've already learned how the Gongon spoke. Now, let us follow that message through the empire, from the drum towers near the royal court to the far-flung provinces of a realm governed not by paper, but by percussion. At the heart of the Oyo Empire stood the Alafin, the emperor whose very name meant owner of the palace. But owning a palace was not the same as owning power. In fact, Oyo's political structure was not autocratic. It was a web of careful balances, between central authority and regional governors, between ritual and realism, between oral command and local action. To maintain control across such a vast terrain, the Alafin relied on a system of trusted provincial administrators called Agil. These officials, stationed in towns under Oyo control, acted as the emperor's eyes, ears, and hands. But how did they receive orders? How did they report trouble? Drums. The imperial drumlines became the nervous system through which Oyo communicated policy, demanded tribute, requested military support, or simply reminded subjects that the center still held. The process was methodical. A message would begin at the palace, often issued during an early morning council attended by the Oyo Messi, the aristocratic council that counterbalanced the Alafin's authority. Once agreed upon, a designated court drummer would encode the message into tonal language and begin the relay. These messages weren't passed willy-nilly across the countryside. No, the Oyo system had relay points, specific towns with trained drummers whose entire role was to listen for, transcribe, and transmit messages accurately. Each node was manned by a designated Ayan family, hereditary custodians of this responsibility. Their homesteads often had elevated platforms, so the sound could travel farther, and designated silent zones, fields or open spaces where no other sound was permitted during drumming transmissions. There were rules. The drummer at each post would confirm the incoming message by repeating it back. Wait for a signal, often a short phrase like "Itan," it is complete. Drum the message forward to the next point. It was a system not unlike Morse code telegraphy, though separated by centuries and geographies. Take, for example, the yearly tax collection ritual known as the Isumalo Run. Each vassal state was required to send tribute, often in the form of cowries, colonnuts, horses, or slaves, to the Alafin. The timing, value, and method were all preordained and delivered by drum in mid-season, around the yam harvest. But the drums weren't just reminders. They were warnings. If a tribute was late or reduced, the drum message would change subtly in tone, a rising phrase here, a clipped note there, that implied displeasure. A second message would come days later, harsher, with the idiomatic drum translation of the hawk circles, but does not call twice. When even that went unanswered, the third message came with military consequence. The Eso, the imperial cavalry, would ride not long after. All this from the drum. In a culture dominated by male ritual roles, one might imagine women excluded from this communication network. But the truth is quieter and more nuanced. In many villages, women wielded small, ceremonial drums, often the ayu, mother of drums, used during festivals and market days. These drums did not carry formal messages, but they played a critical social function, echoing and softening official decrees through call-and-response poetry, singing, and storytelling. They created oral interpretations of drum messages, making imperial orders accessible to the everyday person, especially to women, children, and elders who may not have recognized formal idioms. In this way, women were the interpreters of policy, if not the authors. Not all drum messages bore neutral or celebratory news. Some delivered judgment. The most feared was the ikugangan, the death drum. When a noble, general, or even the elephant himself died, the message was never stated plainly. Instead, the drum would begin with a long roll of ancestral praise, followed by a quiet pause, a ritual silence. Then, slowly, the name of the deceased would be played, followed by a coded phrase indicating they had crossed the river. The phrase was different for each social rank. For a noble, the elephant returns to dust. For a general, the spear is laid down at the foot of the mountain. For the elephant, the sun has closed its eye. After this, a waiting period began. Succession rituals, morning dances, political reshuffling. All of it initiated, not by messenger, not by parchment, but by the low whisper of leather stretched over wood. The sound of endings. But what happened when someone tampered with the drums? There were incidents, rare but significant, of drummers altering the message intentionally. In one such case, a drummer in the frontier province of Ibarapa shifted the tone of a royal message to favor a local warlord. The result? Confusion, delay, and eventually, bloodshed. The crime was discovered only when an Oyo Messi envoy visited and heard a different version of the order. The punishment? The drummer was shamed publicly, his drum destroyed before him, and he was exiled without tools or trade. For an Ayan, that was worse than death. It was erasure. Thus, integrity among drummers was seen not merely as honorable, it was ritually enforced. Ayan families took oaths, poured libations, and performed rites before transmitting politically sensitive messages. The drumbeat was sacred not because of the drum, but because of the truth it promised. By the early 19th century, cracks began to form in this acoustic empire. The Atlantic slave trade had shifted power dynamics. Guns became more valuable than drums. British and French traders brought paper, ink, and ultimately treaties that ignored the slow cadence of ritual. And still, the drums played. Increasingly ignored, increasingly symbolic. But in certain villages, elders remember. There are stories told in evening gatherings, of times when a drum changed the course of a war, or when a courtship was begun by the rhythm of praise. If you listen closely, they say, you can still hear them. In the wind, in the cracking branches, in the hollow echo of footfalls over hard earth, the rhythm lingers. But what, then, do we make of a world where sound once meant sovereignty? What do we lose when governance forgets to sing? Imagine it. The dusk settles once more across the savannah, and the land begins its slow descent into night. But tonight, there is no drum, no praise song, no signal echoing across the tall grasses. Only silence. And in that silence, the empire slips away. In this final section, we explore the decline, transformation, and afterlife of the Oyo Empire's sonic infrastructure. What happens when a society built on sound must confront a world ruled by writing, colonization, and foreign systems? What happens to the drummers? By the early 1800s, the Oyo Empire, once the most formidable West African state of its time, began to fracture. The reasons were many. Internal political instability, as the Oyo Messi increasingly clashed with the Elephant over control. The rise of powerful rivals like the Sokoto Caliphate to the north. The expansion of the Atlantic slave trade, which shifted power away from traditional structures and toward coastal intermediaries. And perhaps most symbolically devastating, the changing nature of communication itself. As trade intensified with Europeans along the coast, a new class of intermediaries arose. Men who could read and write in Portuguese, English, or Arabic. These traders, missionaries, and colonial officials dismissed drum language as primitive. They wanted documents, contracts, records, not rhythms. And so, the drum became muted, first politically, then spiritually. As provinces declared autonomy and wars broke out, many of the iron drummers fled. Some were killed in the violence. Others abandoned their post, hiding their drums or selling them for food. Yet a few continued to drum, not for governance, but for memory. They became griots, entertainers, or ceremonial performers. Their tones shifted from decree to nostalgia. Still, these drummers remembered the codes. In quiet corners, they played messages no longer required, summoning bales, chiefs, who would never arrive, announcing taxes that would never be collected. These were rituals of refusal, an act of cultural resistance. In towns like Igboho, old men gathered in the evenings to talk to the ancestors through drums. It was part mourning, part survival. In this way, the whispering drums refused to fully die. They simply changed frequency. By the time the British established a protectorate over Yorubaland in the late 19th century, the drum had been reduced to a cultural artifact, occasionally showcased at colonial exhibitions or recorded by anthropologists who saw only the performance, never the message. Missionaries discouraged drum practices, calling them pagan. Christian converts abandoned the ceremonies. Children were no longer taught the language of the gongon. The once vital infrastructure of the empire became folklore. In Lagos and Ibadan, emerging urban centers, modernity drowned out the rhythms of old. Typewriters replaced tension chords. Bureaucrats replaced iron drummers. And yet, the drum waited. In homes, in oral stories, in small ceremonies marking births and funerals, in the hands of elders who remembered how a beat could once summon a king. Surprisingly, the drum's journey did not end in silence. Through the transatlantic slave trade, the talking drum, and the knowledge to use it, spread across the Caribbean, Brazil, and parts of the American South. There, it evolved into forms like the atabaque in candomblé rituals or bata drums in Cuban Santeria. Though stripped of their bureaucratic function, these drums retained a memory of power, used to summon orixas, spirits, mark ritual time, and convey emotion beyond speech. Even today, in a candomblé temple in Salvador, Bahia, a priest might explain, the drum speaks to the gods. It's an echo, faint, distorted, of a time when it also spoke to kings. In recent years, efforts have emerged to revive the lost art of drum language in Nigeria. Universities like the University of Ibadan and cultural institutes in Osogbo have begun documenting the codified tones of Yoruba drum speech. Workshops are held for young people. Elders are interviewed. Drum performances are staged not just as entertainment, but as acts of preservation. There are even digital transcriptions of drum phrases, attempts to map tonal patterns to written Yoruba and back again. Researchers have begun cataloging names and praise poems played on drums, ritual phrases used in royal courts, common idioms for messages like gather, war, rain, or death. But it is difficult. Much was never written, and those who knew the full codes have long passed on. Even so, the attempt matters. Because to revive the drum is not just to recover a musical form, it is to reconnect with a worldview. One in which communication was not separate from the sacred, where every beat bore the weight of intention, and where governance came not with signatures, but with rhythm. The talking drums of the Oyo Empire teach us something about the fragility of power and the endurance of culture. A single drumbeat once summoned armies. A slight variation could send a chief into exile. A cadence, properly played, was law. And when the empires fell, when the palaces were overrun, it was the drum, not the sword, that continued to echo. And now, in the modern world of endless screens and silent notifications, the whispering drum reminds us that communication is never neutral. It always carries more than information. It carries the soul of the society that built it. So, perhaps, the next time you hear a beat in the distance, be it music, footsteps, or even your own heart, you'll wonder, what messages have we forgotten how to hear? Close your eyes. Imagine standing in an ocean of golden sand. No birds, no trees, no wind that doesn't carry pain. The horizon sways under the heat, and everywhere you turn, there is salt. Not sprinkled, not ground, but towering blocks of salt, houses of salt, even walls of pure white, crusted with time. Welcome to Tagaza. Located deep within the Central Sahara, in what is now modern-day Mali near the Algerian border, Tagaza was once one of the most important, and most desolate outposts of the trans-Saharan trade. It wasn't a town in the traditional sense. There were no gardens, no rivers, no native population that called it home year-round. In fact, no one truly lived in Tagaza. People worked there. People died there. But they did not live in the sense we often think of: family, community, comfort. Tagaza existed only because of what lay beneath and around it: salt. Massive deposits of rock salt, formed from long evaporated seabeds, had been exposed over centuries. Traders and laborers came not to build homes or farms, but to carve out wealth directly from the earth. The town's buildings? Entirely constructed from large slabs of salt, rectangular, glistening, and harsh. Roofs were sometimes wooden, imported at great expense. But the walls? They could be licked and tasted. And they were. Salt in Tagaza was not merely seasoning. It was currency, and for centuries, it was worth its weight in gold, sometimes more. You might think of desert trade as exotic, but the reality was painfully practical. Tagaza existed solely to supply the salt needs of empires further south, especially the wealthy cities of the Mali and later Songhai empires, where salt was crucial for preserving food and balancing diets in tropical regions. But the salt had to get there, and so it was moved by camels. Thousands of them, in slow, deliberate caravans. Known as the Azalai, these salt caravans were logistics miracles of survival. Each journey began in places like Timbuktu and involved hundreds of men, often slaves, and camels, carrying both water and empty saddles to bring back salt. To reach Tagaza required weeks of travel through terrain with no water, no forage, and shifting dunes that could bury travelers in silence. Caravans moved by night when possible, navigating by stars, and stopped to rest during the scalding midday sun. They followed ancient markers, skeletons of fallen camels, piles of stones, or worn paths barely visible unless you knew how to see them. Getting lost was not uncommon. Dying was not either. And yet they came, again and again, because the wealth of empires depended on it. Tagaza was not a city of joy. It was a work camp, often manned by enslaved laborers drawn from sub-Saharan Africa. Most worked under brutal conditions, using iron tools to chip away massive slabs from the salt flats. These blocks, usually about 90 centimeters long and weighing up to 30 kilograms, were shaped into uniform units called amoli. In many parts of West Africa, amoli functioned as a form of currency, traded for gold, ivory, millet, or cattle. But the workers in Tagaza rarely saw gold or millet. They lived in salt houses, slept on salt floors, and drank brackish water imported in clay jars. Nothing grew. Not even insects survived long in the desiccated wind. Food, grain and dried fish, was imported. Even firewood had to be brought in. The cost of simply not dying in Tagaza was immense. And yet, the salt never stopped flowing. A single camel in a caravan could carry 2 or 3 blocks of salt, meaning a caravan of 1,000 camels might return with 2,000 to 3,000 blocks. This might seem like abundance, but consider the scale of need. Cities like Gao or Timbuktu had populations in the tens of thousands. Armies required salt to preserve meat. Religious leaders received it as tribute. It was used in ritual purification, especially in Sahelian Islamic practices. Thus, the demand was insatiable. And every block had to be carried by camel and man, across heat so oppressive that leather water pouches boiled from the inside, if left exposed. There was no alternative, no shortcut, no sea route, just sand and salt. And yet, somehow, this made sense. Because salt was survival. The role of slavery in Tagaza cannot be understated. Enslaved people, often taken in war or raids, were assigned the most punishing labor. Some were leased by powerful Tuareg merchants who controlled desert passage. Others were sent by the Malian Musa, emperor, as part of state resource management. These workers carved, carried, and loaded the blocks. In many cases, they never left. Tagaza became a place of exile, where labor meant disappearance. Travelers of the time, including the famous 14th-century Moroccan scholar Ibn Battuta, passed through Tagaza and described it with disdain. He noted its horrors, the absence of anything soft or green, and the cruelty of its rhythms. And yet, it continued to function, not as a city, but as a logistical machine grinding onward for the sake of empire. Salt was not just a commodity in the Western Sahel, it was part of identity. Certain regions were known for white salt, others for red salt. Prices fluctuated depending on grain yields, caravan security, and political control of trade routes. In some eras, wars were fought over salt mines, just as today they are fought over oil. Tagaza, in particular, was so central to the salt economy that some Saharan tribes claimed it as sacred ground. Not because it was beautiful, not because it was spiritual, but because everything else depended on it. And so, like the gears of a vast clock, the salt trade turned. Predictable, grinding, relentless. But as the 15th century approached and the Songhai Empire rose, new centers of salt, like Tadeni, further north, began to eclipse Tagaza. Still, for a time, Tagaza was the center of a world built on dust, a place where no one lived, yet thousands survived because it existed. And here we pause, as a caravan appears on the horizon, a line of camels stretching into the glowing desert haze. What happens when they arrive? And what becomes of those left behind in salt? The caravan arrives. Slowly, silently, camels kneel as men in loose turbans dismount. Their feet sink into pale dust, not sand, but the crumbling flakes of discarded salt. It crunches underfoot like bones. There is no greeting, no music, no festival, just work. The Azalai caravan has returned to Tagaza. By the 14th century, Tagaza was one of the most economically important and least hospitable places in the Mali Empire. Despite having no food, no arable land, and no resident population aside from enslaved laborers, Tagaza generated immense wealth through the salt trade. Entire kingdoms south of the Sahara depended on it to preserve food, treat leather, prepare medicine, and flavor meals. But it was more than utility. Salt had ritual value, too. In Mali, salt was sometimes used to seal contracts, bless children, or anoint leaders. It was believed that salt protected against evil spirits and that the body required it for spiritual balance. A bowl of salt at a door was both an offering and a warning. Tagaza was not just an industrial site. It was a spiritual resource. But no one stayed long. Laborers rotated through, often against their will. Caravan leaders stayed only to load. Even soldiers assigned to protect the site rotated frequently. Tagaza was a town of transients, built not for living but for extraction. Tagaza's operation was a marvel of human endurance, held together by a brutal logic. Mining. Enslaved workers used iron picks to carve out blocks of salt from the ground. The salt beds were so extensive that they shimmered like lakes under the sun. Shaping. Blocks were cut into standard sizes for easy stacking, 30 to 40 kilogram slabs known as a mole. Storage. Salt blocks were stacked into piles and sometimes housed inside salt buildings to protect them from theft or sand damage. Transport. Caravans, once rested and resupplied, loaded up the salt, typically 2 to 3 blocks per camel, secured with rope and wrapped in woven mats. No one worked quickly. The sun prevented haste. Heat stroke was common and dehydration constant. The work was not timed by clocks, but by survival. Every resource, water, tools, food, cloth, had to be imported, often at staggering cost. It's estimated that the price of water in Tagaza sometimes exceeded the value of grain. Entire camels were assigned to carry nothing but water. That water, once warm and stale, was still rationed drop by drop. The Moroccan traveler and historian Ibn Battuta, whose journeys across the Islamic world are among the most detailed medieval travel records, passed through Tagaza in the mid-14th century. His impressions were clear: disgust, awe, and sadness. He described houses made of salt. He mentioned the brackish, foul-tasting water, sourced from wells several days away and brought in by caravan. He wrote of laborers without freedom, slowly dying as they mined block after block. He did not linger. Most travelers didn't. But his account confirms what oral histories also suggest, that Tagaza was never a city, but a machine, a place where the gears of economy turned through muscle, misery, and silence. In West Africa, especially among the Mande, Hausa, and Sonic peoples, salt functioned as money. The amole blocks from Tagaza could be exchanged for 3 to 4 measures of millet, 1 to 2 lengths of cloth, a portion of gold dust, often measured by weight using small brass scales. Or, tragically, another human being. Salt was portable, divisible, and universally valued, the perfect medium of exchange. In some marketplaces, salt slabs were stacked in booths like silver bars. Children grew up learning to identify the good salt, white, dense, without bitter aftertaste, from the inferior. Some traders even hoarded salt in underground pits, protecting it as they would gold. Entire fortunes were stored in blocks that, in other climates, would have melted away. Tagaza, thus, was not just a mine, it was the mint of the Sahelian empires. The region around Tagaza was nominally under the control of the Mali Empire, but in practice, it was often managed, or more accurately, tolerated, by the Tuareg confederacies who roamed the Sahara. These nomadic peoples, known for their mastery of desert travel and formidable raiding parties, controlled the caravan routes. No salt left Tagaza without their blessing, and their tax. In exchange for safe passage, Tuareg groups levied tolls on the caravans, supplied guides, and occasionally policed the mines when unrest broke out. Their role was ambiguous. They were not formal governors, but they held real power. A caravan leader might fear the Tuareg more than the emperor. An unauthorized trip through the desert could result in total disappearance. This informal oversight turned Tagaza into a fragile triangle of power. Enslaved workers did the mining. Malian agents managed output and taxation. Tuareg forces controlled the roads and security. It was a balance maintained by necessity, not trust. By the 15th century, another salt center began to rise, Tadeni, located about 500 kilometers north of Tagaza. Though even more remote, it offered deeper and purer salt deposits. As the Songhai Empire replaced Mali, its leaders shifted trade attention northward. Tagaza's infrastructure began to crumble. Wells ran dry. Laborers were relocated. And slowly, the salt walls began to collapse. Some traders still passed through, but the flow dwindled. Where once hundreds of camels gathered, now only a few came each month. Salt became less profitable. Political borders shifted. And in time, Tagaza was abandoned. The buildings, made of salt, were slowly eaten by wind, sand, and the occasional rainstorm. Cracks widened. Roofs sagged. Doorways sealed with drifted dunes. Today, little remains but mounds of crumbling salt and half-buried outlines of once functional buildings. Ghostly monuments to a place that existed solely for others. To walk through Tagaza today, if you could, would be to wander a desert of memory. No signposts. No inscriptions. Just crumbling salt, drifting sand, and silence. And yet, every grain of wealth that passed through medieval West Africa bore Tagaza's fingerprint. From gold traded in Europe to manuscripts copied in Timbuktu to feasts in the courts of Gao, all touched by salt. The bones of an empire rest in that white dust. So we are left to ask, when an entire civilization relies on a place no one calls home, what happens when that place is gone? The caravan has departed. In the wake of their slow, deliberate march, only the wind remains. It whistles through broken walls made of forgotten salt. No footprints linger. No voices echo. Just the quiet crumble of empire returning to dust. Tagaza is gone, not by fire, nor war, nor flood, but by irrelevance. And in its silence, we begin to understand a deeper truth, that civilizations do not always vanish in explosions. Some dissolve, slowly, like salt under rain. We often think of salt as seasoning, something extra, optional. But for the medieval empires of West Africa, it was the foundation. Every aspect of daily life touched salt. Food was preserved with it. Leather was cured in it. Wounds were treated by it. Prayers were sealed with it. Currency was measured in it. Tagaza was not a town, but a machine built to produce this essential material. But when you build a civilization on an extractive process, when a place exists solely to be harvested, it eventually runs dry. And Tagaza did. The history books speak of Mali's grandeur, Songhai's army, Timbuktu's scholarship. But rarely do they mention the laborers of Tagaza, the people who hacked salt from the earth in silence, drank foul water in silence, died in silence. We do not know their names. We have no written record of their stories. But they were there, thousands of them, over centuries. It is a quiet injustice of history. That which sustains us is often forgotten first. The salt miners of Tagaza sustained courts, fed armies, supported scholars. Their labor was folded invisibly into the wealth of empires. And when they were no longer needed, they were discarded, just as the town itself was discarded. There is no monument to them, no inscription on stone, only the salt. As Tagaza declined, Tadini rose to take its place. The Songhai Empire shifted trade networks northward. Meanwhile, European ships began encroaching on coastal trade, slowly reducing the significance of the trans-Saharan routes. But the caravan culture continued for centuries. Even into the 20th century, small Azali caravans still crossed the Sahara with salt. In fact, a few still do. A slow, fading tradition. A living echo. Though Tagaza was abandoned, the concept of salt as a lifeline persisted. In local folklore, Tagaza became a symbol, not of wealth, but of cost. The cost of empire. The cost of survival. The cost of forgetting. The site of Tagaza today is almost unrecognizable. Occasional visitors, archaeologists, adventurers, report collapsed salt walls, brittle and melting into the ground. Some sections are completely buried under shifting dunes. Others glint in the light like bones unearthed. But there is no signage, no fencing, no protection. Tagaza remains a non-place, just as it was for those who lived and worked there. Not a home, not a city, but a function. Yet in this crumbling void lies a lesson, that the most essential places are often the most fragile. And that wealth, when built on unacknowledged labor, eventually collapses under the weight of forgetting. Today, across the world, we build extraction zones that resemble Tagaza more than we care to admit. Oil fields where no one settles. Lithium mines where no child plays. Massive logistics ports where goods flow and humans disappear. These modern-day Tagazas are places designed not for life, but for movement, to feed systems elsewhere. Just as salt once flowed from Tagaza to Timbuktu, so now cobalt flows from Congo to California. And still, the labor remains invisible. Still, the places remain temporary. Still, the sacrifice is considered someone else's story. And yet, salt endures. It does not rust. It does not rot. It does not burn. Even now, blocks of Tagaza salt may remain buried beneath the sand, intact, crystalline, waiting. They may never be found. They may never be needed again. But they remain in silence. And so does the lesson of Tagaza, that empires can rise from silence, that lives can be spent in places no one remembers, that sometimes history is not made by those who speak, but by those who mine, wordlessly, endlessly, under a sun that never sets. And so we ask, when the world is built on unseen hands, how do we choose what to remember? You sit in a shaded courtyard beneath the wide leaves of a forest fig tree. Around you are markets, rich with fabrics, cola nuts, palm oil, dried fish. And on the table before you, not coins, not bills, but tiny brass figurines. A crocodile, a pair of scales, a stool, a spider. You are in the Ashanti Empire, and these are your weights. They will determine the price of every transaction. And if you do not understand what they mean, you will lose. In the heart of present-day Ghana, the Ashanti Empire, also spelled Asante, rose to prominence in the 17th century and lasted well into the 19th. It was one of the wealthiest and most militarily powerful states in pre-colonial Africa, built upon a complex economic system centered on gold dust. Unlike coin-based systems in Europe or paper currencies in East Asia, the Ashanti economy functioned through weighed gold, tiny flakes or granules kept in tightly sealed leather pouches and measured out during every transaction. But weights were needed, and so they created them, not as dull standard blocks, but as miniature sculptures, each imbued with meaning. Known as abremuo, gold weights, these tiny brass artifacts are among the most fascinating and understated tools of commerce in world history. At first glance, Ashanti gold weights appear purely utilitarian. They range from abstract geometric shapes to intricate representations of animals, people, tools, or proverbs. But each shape was more than decoration, it was information. A tortoise might represent patience or cunning. A fishhook might represent a trade agreement. A two-headed crocodile might warn against internal division. While every weight had a specific mass, based on local standards like the ta, pariwa, or adwin. It also had a story, a message embedded in its form. Merchants, traders, and royal agents were trained to read these messages as part of their commercial literacy. A buyer might present weights that subtly expressed suspicion. A seller might lay down a weight shaped like a drum, signifying readiness to negotiate. It was commerce by metaphor. A typical transaction began with the buyer and seller agreeing on a price, not in a fixed amount, but in weight. Then, out came the tiny scales, often made of wood, bronze, or ivory. The buyer would open their pouch of gold dust, called sika, and begin measuring it against the agreed weight. The scales beam was suspended from a hook or hand. Weights were placed on one pan, gold dust on the other. Transactions were exact, sometimes requiring microscopic adjustments using a feather or fine straw. There was no central mint. No standardized national currency. Yet the system worked. Because the weights themselves were trusted, ritualized, and rooted in cultural narratives. Gold weights were typically cast using the lost wax technique, a method involving sculpting a model in wax, covering it in clay, heating it to melt out the wax, and then filling the cavity with molten brass or bronze. The craftsmanship was detailed and personal. Every piece bore the handprint of its maker and their intention. Some weights were made purely for transactions. Others were made for ritual, gifted during ceremonies, or used to communicate political messages. Weights were stored in elaborately carved wooden boxes and passed down across generations. A trader's weight set was not just their economic toolkit. It was their inheritance, their signature, and their voice. And to use someone else's weights? That was considered an insult, unless permission had been given. Ashanti gold weights represent something often forgotten in modern economics. The idea that trade is not just numerical, but moral. Weights shaped like human figures with bound hands reminded traders of the consequences of dishonesty. Weights depicting scales tipped to one side warned against greed. Weights shaped like mothers nursing children emphasized nurturing, fairness, and reciprocity. Through these tiny sculptures, a worldview was taught, one in which economics, ethics, and culture were tightly interwoven. Transactions were not faceless. They were performances of social balance, and each weight played a role. You may wonder, if every weight is different, how did the system avoid chaos? The Ashanti Empire had a set of standardized weight units, passed down and maintained by royal goldsmiths. These included units like Abujua, the heaviest standard, Bako, Du, Ta, and others, each representing a fractional measure of gold dust. But even within these units, variation was allowed, so long as the total weight matched the standard. This is what made the Ashanti system so resilient. It was precise, but not rigid. It was symbolic, but also mathematical. It was regulated, but also deeply personal. In other words, it was a commerce of balance, not only in scales, but in society. Markets in Ashanti towns like Kumasi were alive with these quiet transactions. No loud shouting, no paper bills. Just the soft clink of weights being placed, the whisper of scales tipping, and the faint sift of gold dust. Merchants spoke with their hands, their weights, and their knowledge of symbols. A market transaction could last minutes or hours, depending not just on price, but on social context, kinship, and the implied meaning of the weights themselves. A trader offering a crocodile weight might be testing your cleverness. A buyer responding with a stool might be asserting their status. These were not negotiations. They were dialogues, slow, encoded, and steeped in cultural wisdom. But as we peer into this forest economy, a question arises. What happens when outside traders arrive, with scales of their own, coins instead of gold dust, and no understanding of what the crocodile means? The air in Kumasi is heavy with the scent of palm oil, cola nuts, and wood smoke. Merchants sit cross-legged, arranging their scales. A buyer approaches with a leather pouch, its strings tied tight. It is time to measure. Not by coin, not by promise, but by weight. This is not just a purchase. This is participation in a system that kept one of Africa's greatest empires in balance. Gold weight usage was not confined to the Ashanti alone. The practice extended across the broader Akan-speaking peoples of West Africa, Fanti, Denkyira, Akyem, and others. But the Ashanti took the practice to its most complex and symbolic form. By the 18th century, the Ashanti Empire had unified vast territories under the authority of the Asantehene king. Trade moved not only within villages but across regional markets, caravan routes, and international exchanges. Yet through it all, the gold weight system provided consistency. Whether one was buying cloth in a rural market or negotiating tribute at court, the same process unfolded, weights placed on a scale. Gold dust sifted in, feather by feather, grain by grain. A nod, a pause, and an agreement. This continuity created trust across distance, across class, across power. Gold weights became, over time, not just tools of commerce, but mnemonic devices for proverbs. Each weight reminded the user of a moral truth, a warning, or a shared cultural story. A weight shaped like two crocodiles sharing one stomach evoked the proverb, "They may fight, but they eat from the same source." A warning against political division. A weight showing a man carrying another on his back recalled, "If you climb a good tree, you will get a push." A reminder of collective support. A weight shaped like a spider evoked a Nance, the trickster figure of Akan folklore, symbolizing cunning, wisdom, and the importance of storytelling. Thus, every transaction became a lesson. To exchange gold was also to exchange meaning. Trade reinforced cultural memory. A market, then, was not only an economic center. It was a classroom, a shrine, and a stage for society's deepest values. At the highest level of Ashanti governance, gold weights were integral to tribute and diplomacy. Chiefs brought offerings of gold dust to the Asantehene. Tribute was measured publicly with weights, confirming both the material and symbolic loyalty of subordinates. The scales of the king's court were heavy, ornate, and carried by appointed officials who specialized in measurement. Weights used in royal courts were often larger, more elaborate, and laden with meaning. Stools represented authority. Swords represented war. Drums represented order and ritual. Human figures represented ancestors and lineage. When tribute was measured, it was not simply wealth being confirmed. It was cosmic balance, the kingdom aligning itself through weight and dust. Of course, no system is immune to fraud. Some merchants attempted to cheat by carrying altered weights, either filed down to weigh less or filled with heavier alloys. Others tampered with their scales, tipping them ever so slightly. The Ashanti state responded with regulation. Markets often had inspectors, and fraud was punished severely. A dishonest trader could face fines, confiscation of property, or even banishment. But more powerful than punishment was shame. Since weights carried symbolic meaning, to manipulate them was not just theft. It was an insult to the community's moral fabric. A man known for false weights was considered untrustworthy in every aspect of life. Thus, honesty was not just encouraged by law, but embedded in the very symbols traders touched daily. By the 15th century, Europeans began arriving along the Gold Coast. Portuguese, Dutch, Danish, and eventually British traders brought not only guns and goods, but coins, minted, stamped, and unfamiliar. At first, coins had little use inland. Why accept a stamped disc of silver when one could weigh actual gold? European merchants, too, often adopted the Ashanti system, carrying scales and weights of their own. But misunderstandings abounded. A European might see a crocodile weight as mere decoration, missing its deeper meaning. An Ashanti trader might accept a coin, but only after weighing it, treating it like any other nugget of metal. Over time, however, the pressure grew. Coins could not be ignored. European forts along the coast increasingly insisted on currency. And yet, deep in Ashanti territory, the language of gold dust remained dominant. This dual economy created tension, dust inland, coin on the coast. And in between, cultural misunderstandings grew. By the 19th century, European missionaries and colonizers began documenting Ashanti culture. They marveled at the gold weights, often collecting them as curiosities. But they misunderstood them. Some described them as toys, others as purely ornamental. Few grasped that these were economic instruments, tied to mathematics, morality, and daily survival. In this way, gold weights were gradually stripped of their context, displayed in European museums without their scales, without their dust, without their stories. What was once a living language became, in foreign eyes, artifacts of curiosity. As British power expanded inland in the late 19th century, The Ashanti Empire faced military conquest. With colonization came the forced adoption of European coinage and the suppression of traditional economic practices. Gold weights declined in practical use. The language of dust was silenced by coins, contracts, and imposed laws. But the memory lingered. Families preserved weight sets as heirlooms. Craftsmen continued making weights, not for markets, but for heritage. And the stories remained in proverbs, in oral history, in quiet remembrance. Now we are left at a crossroads. If gold weights once balanced an empire, what happens when the scales are taken away? What survives when the symbols of trade are no longer used in trade itself? The scales are quiet now. No dust sifts into balance. No tiny brass crocodiles lie upon the pan. The markets of Kumasi still bustle with yam sellers, cloth traders, and storytellers, but the weights have been replaced by paper, by coin, by the distant hum of banks. The language of gold dust has fallen silent. Yet, the gold weights remain. By the late 19th century, the British conquest of the Ashanti region marked the end of gold dust as the dominant medium of exchange. Coins and colonial currency replaced it, first forcibly, then practically, as European trade systems demanded uniformity. The Ashanti resistance was fierce. Wars fought to maintain independence. Battles waged not just for territory, but for sovereignty over daily life. Yet in the realm of economics, the battle was harder to fight. Coins required less effort than measuring grains of dust. They were easier to transport, quicker in market exchange, and backed by military power. And so, slowly, the weights were put away. Scales were folded into boxes, dust was locked into chests, and the daily ritual of balancing morality and commerce faded from public view. But the story did not end. Families across Ashanti lands preserved their gold weight sets. Some were handed down as heirlooms, stored in carved boxes alongside old scales and dust scoops. Others were kept in shrines, remembered as symbols of ancestors' wisdom. To inherit a set of weights was to inherit a story, not of wealth, but of judgment. They reminded descendants of how their forebears traded with honesty, balance, and cultural pride. Thus, the weights survived, not as instruments of commerce, but as instruments of memory. In the 20th century, gold weights became objects of fascination for European and American collectors. Removed from their context, they were displayed as artifacts of African art, admired for their craftsmanship, their miniature beauty, their intricate detail. But this gaze stripped them of meaning. A crocodile was not just a crocodile. A stool was not just a stool. Each weight was a proverb cast in brass, a sentence in a language of trade. To view them only as sculpture is to see the letters of a text, but not the story they spell. In museums across the world, from London to New York, Berlin to Paris, gold weights rest behind glass. They gleam under lights, but their scales are gone. Their dust is gone. Their voices are gone. Yet, the Ashanti themselves did not forget. The proverbs tied to the weights remain alive in oral culture. Stories of Anansi the spider are still told in Ghanaian villages. Elders still repeat sayings about crocodiles with one stomach, or mothers nursing children, or scales that must balance fairly. The weights live on in language, even if they no longer weigh gold. In schools, in festivals, in cultural revivals, the Abramuo are taught to young generations, not as tools, but as philosophy. They are reminders that economics is never just numbers. It is trust, ethics, symbolism. It is culture. Today, Ghanaian artists and craftspeople sometimes make gold weights for sale to tourists, collectors, and heritage markets. These are no longer instruments of daily trade, but they are part of a revival of pride in Akan traditions. Some Ghanaian historians call for the return of gold weights from European museums, not because they want to measure gold again, but because they want to reconnect with the cultural logic they embody. The Ashanti gold weights stand as a quiet testament that trade, at its best, can be a conversation shaped by values. Where modern economies often feel faceless and abstract, the gold weights remind us that every exchange once had a face, a story, and a proverb to guide it. So we return to that shaded courtyard, beneath the fig tree, where the scales once tipped and gold dust once fell like sunlight. The crocodile weight lies still. The spider waits in silence. The stool sits empty. The language has faded, but not vanished. And perhaps the real lesson is this: that wealth is not only what we hold in our hands, but what we choose to remember. The Ashanti gold weights remind us that economy is culture, that numbers carry meaning, and that even the smallest objects, no larger than a finger, can bear the weight of an empire. And so we ask, in a world now measured by digits and data, what symbols guide our scales? Imagine standing before the red earth walls of Benin City. The air is heavy with incense and the sound of bronze gongs. It is not an ordinary day. The king, the Oba of Benin, emerges in his coral-beaded regalia. Priests chant, drummers mark the rhythm, and dancers move in precise sequence. You look closer and realize, this is not simply celebration. This is timekeeping. This is how the people of Benin marked the passage of days, weeks, months, and years, not with numbers on paper, but with ritual cycles. The Kingdom of Benin, flourishing from the 13th to 19th centuries in what is now southern Nigeria, had no written calendar in the European sense. Instead, time was experienced and measured through ritual events, agricultural rhythms, and royal ceremonies. Life was not divided into abstract units, but into moments of significance. The planting of yams, when the rains began. The Igu festival, when the Oba renewed his spiritual power. The Yuji-era Oba, honoring royal ancestors. The Ewer ceremony, marking renewal and cleansing at year's end. Thus, every important date was remembered through its connection to ritual and obligation, not numbers. At the base of daily life was the market cycle, known as Ik. Markets in Benin City and surrounding towns rotated every 4 days, forming a repeating sequence. This was the most practical unit of time. People would say, "I will meet you in 2 markets," meaning 8 days. Traders, farmers, and craftsmen lived by this cycle. Unlike the 7-day week familiar today, Benin's calendar turned in 4s, anchoring social and economic rhythms to something visible and shared. The beat of the drum in the palace, the bustle of the market square, these were clocks. Months were not marked by names, but by ritual seasons. For example, the season of yam planting, the season of harvest, the season of ancestral rites, the season of royal renewal. Each month began and ended with a festival or observance. Priests and chiefs kept memory of when ceremonies should occur, ensuring that agricultural and spiritual duties were aligned. This system meant that time was never empty. Each period carried significance, tied to ancestors, gods, or the Oba himself. Unlike modern secular calendars, the Benin calendar revolved around the person of the Oba. He was not just king, but also chief priest and temporal anchor. His actions marked the rhythm of the year. When the Oba performed the Igu ritual, it was the new year. When he poured libations to royal ancestors, a cycle of remembrance began. When he held court festivals, they aligned with seasonal transitions. The people of Benin did not ask, "What year is it?" Instead, they asked, "Which ritual has been completed?" Or "Which festival is approaching?" The Oba's presence gave meaning to time itself. Without him, the calendar could not turn. Benin's famous bronze plaques, cast by guild artists in the royal workshops, were not just decoration. They functioned as historical markers, recording sequences of rulers, battles, and rituals. Some plaques depict processions, others ceremonies, others the Oba surrounded by attendants. To the Benin court, these plaques were visual memory devices, a way of fixing time through image rather than numbers. Where Europe used chronicles, Benin used bronzes. Where China used scrolls, Benin used ritual masks. History was kept not on paper, but in art and performance. For ordinary people, time passed not in minutes or hours, but in tasks. A farmer knew the season by the soil's texture. A fisherman knew the tide by the pull of the river. A trader knew the market day by the sound of gongs calling buyers. In Benin, you did not need to know the date. You needed to know when to act. The system was pragmatic, rooted in survival and rhythm, not abstraction. And yet, it worked efficiently, predictably, quietly. An entire kingdom of tens of thousands functioned without numbered calendars. But what happens when memory falters? When priests are killed in war? When bronzes are taken away? When rituals are disrupted? Unlike a paper calendar that can be stored in archives, the Benin calendar depended on people remembering and rituals repeating. It was strong while intact, but fragile under interruption. An interruption would come. So here we pause. If time itself was kept by the Oba and his priests, what happens when colonial powers arrive, carrying clocks, almanacs, and new ways of marking days? It is the late 15th century. A new sound enters the rhythms of Benin, the clatter of ships, the language of foreign traders, and the ticking of mechanical clocks brought by Portuguese visitors. For a people whose time was measured by ritual cycles, this was more than novelty. It was disruption. The Benin calendar, once unchallenged, now had to contend with a foreign system of measuring days, weeks, and years. What had been a closed cycle began to face pressure from outside. When Portuguese merchants first reached Benin around 1485, they were struck by the city's sophistication, wide streets, organized markets, and powerful rulers. They brought gifts, including clocks and written calendars. For the Portuguese, a clock was a sign of modernity, a tool of governance, even a marker of divine order. For the people of Benin, it was curious but unnecessary. Why measure hours when the market cycle already marked life's rhythms? Why count years when the Oba's rituals renewed society's strength? At first, the systems existed side by side. The Portuguese recorded dates in their ledgers. The Benin people marked events by festivals and rains. But slowly, the foreign system began to intrude, especially in trade negotiations, where exact reckoning of time mattered for contracts and voyages. While Europeans relied on written chronicles, Benin's people continued to anchor time in ritual festivals. The Igu festival, performed annually, cleansed the kingdom of misfortune and renewed the Oba's power. For the Benin people, this was the new year. The Uji-era Oba commemorated ancestors, situating present rulers in the line of the past. It was history remembered through ritual, not text. The Ewer festival marked a season of renewal, where symbolic plants were exchanged as blessings. When someone asked, "When did this battle happen?" the answer was not a numbered year, but in the season after Igu, or in the year when the Oba renewed his stool. The calendar was alive, embodied in ceremony and memory. As Benin's diplomatic and trade ties with Portugal, the Dutch, and later the British deepened, the issue of synchronization arose. European traders wanted dates. They wanted contracts enforceable by time. They wanted to measure voyages by months, not rituals. Benin's chiefs and scribes adapted pragmatically. They began to adopt certain elements of the foreign system when dealing with outsiders, while maintaining the traditional ritual calendar internally. This created a dual time system: external time, negotiated with Europeans; internal time, maintained by ritual cycles and the authority of the Oba. Through all this, the Oba remained the anchor of temporal order. His rituals still marked the year. His court still controlled the rhythm of festivals. But his role as timekeeper gained new tension. To his people, he kept sacred cycles alive. To Europeans, he appeared as a monarch negotiating within a system of dates and years. The Oba straddled two calendars, one sacred, one foreign. Benin's famed bronze plaques and ivory carvings grew even more significant in this period. They did not record numerical time, but they fixed ritual events in image. A plaque showing the Oba at Igu was not 1487 or 1520. It was the year of that ritual. In memory, that was enough. But when these artworks were later seized, particularly during the British invasion of 1897, the calendar they embodied was also fractured. Removing the bronzes was not just looting art. It was looting time itself. By the 19th century, British influence grew heavier. Missionaries taught European calendars in schools. Colonial administrators insisted on recording treaties with precise dates. This undermined the authority of the ritual calendar. If the Igu festival was the start of the year, but the British declared January 1st as New Year, whose authority prevailed, time became not just a measure, but a political weapon. Control of calendars meant control of law, contracts, and legitimacy. In 1897, when the British launched their infamous punitive expedition, burning Benin City and exiling the Oba, it was more than conquest of land. It was conquest of time. With rituals interrupted, bronzes stolen, and priests scattered, the Benin calendar collapsed. The cycle that had anchored centuries of memory was broken. This raises a haunting question. What happens when a society's calendar is oral and embodied, not written? When priests are silenced, rituals interrupted, and memory fractured, the calendar cannot be easily reconstructed. Unlike written almanacs that can be reprinted, the Benin calendar required performance. Without it, silence spreads. So here we are left. If the Oba and his priests were the keepers of time, and their rituals were severed, what remained? Did time itself stop for the Kingdom of Benin? The fires of 1897 still smolder. The British expedition has left Benin City in ruins. The Oba is exiled. Priests are scattered. Bronze plaques are crated up and shipped across oceans. And with them, something less visible but equally vital has been taken: time itself. The Benin calendar, once sustained by ritual, festivals, and memory, collapses under the silence of conquest. The cycles are interrupted. The Oba no longer renews the year with Igu. Ancestors are no longer honored in courtly ritual. Market cycles continue, but the broader rhythm of the kingdom falters. Colonialism did not merely impose foreign laws or seize wealth. It imposed foreign time. Schools in the new colony taught the Gregorian calendar. Children learned to mark January 1st as the start of the year, not Igu. Contracts were signed with European dates. Festivals were mocked as pagan, suppressed, or distorted. What had been an embodied calendar of memory and ceremony was overwritten by clocks and almanacs. It was efficient. It was practical, but it was also an act of erasure. Yet, not all was lost. The Benin people carried fragments of their calendar into the colonial period, hidden in ritual and oral tradition. Families continued to observe certain ancestral days, even if not publicly. Market cycles endured, stubbornly turning in fours, even as colonial weeks turned in sevens. Some priests whispered the old cycles, waiting for the day they could be performed openly again. Time became dual once more. The official, colonial calendar enforced by rulers, and the quiet, remembered calendar carried by families and communities. The bronze plaques and ivory carvings, though removed from their original context, still hold within them the memory of time. Each plaque depicting a ritual procession is a frozen moment of Benin's calendar. Each ivory tusk carved with scenes of festivals is a visual archive. Today, they sit in museums far from home: London, Berlin, New York. They are admired as art, but rarely recognized as timepieces. They are fragments of a calendar that once turned with ritual certainty. When the bronzes are displayed without their story, the clock remains stopped. In recent decades, there has been a revival of Benin cultural heritage. The Igu festival has returned in modern form, performed annually in Benin City, now part of Nigeria. Chiefs and descendants of the royal court continue to honor the rituals, adapting them to new contexts. Though the Oba no longer commands a kingdom, the calendar still turns, slowly, carefully, through memory and ceremony. This revival is not just cultural pride. It is an act of temporal resistance. To perform the Igu festival today is to insist that Benin's time did not truly end in 1897. It was interrupted, but it survived. What can we learn from this? The Benin calendar reminds us that time is never neutral. It is always political, cultural, and spiritual. In Europe, the calendar was tied to the church, marking saints' days and Easter cycles. In Benin, the calendar was tied to the Oba, marking rituals of renewal and ancestry. In colonial Nigeria, time was imposed as a tool of governance, a way to regulate contracts, schools, and labor. The calendar you follow defines the world you live in. For Benin, the collapse of their ritual calendar was a collapse of sovereignty. But its survival, even in fragments, is proof of resilience. Stand again before the ruins of Benin's old walls. Listen for the gongs. Smell the incense. Imagine the Oba stepping forward in coral beads, renewing the year with the Igu ritual. For his people, this was the turning of time. Not January, not clocks, not numbers on a page, but the renewal of balance between ancestors, rulers, and the living. And though colonial conquests sought to silence that rhythm, the echoes remain. So perhaps the question is not whether Benin's time stopped in 1897. Perhaps the question is this: when time is broken, who has the power to start it again? You are standing in the humid depths of the Congo Basin. The air is thick, heavy, alive with the buzz of insects. The forest canopy blocks the sky, but the sound of thunder travels easily through the trees. In this world of shifting rivers, fertile soils, and sudden storms, rain is everything. And those who could summon it, or claim to, held power. The Congo Basin, stretching across modern-day Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, Cameroon, and beyond, is one of the wettest regions on Earth. Yet its people did not take rain for granted. In agricultural societies across the region, the timing of rainfall determined whether harvests would thrive or fail. Too little rain, and crops like millet, yams, or bananas withered. Too much rain, and floods destroyed fields, rotted stores, and drowned settlements. Rain was unpredictable, feared, revered. And so, societies developed a class of specialists, rainmakers, ritual leaders, shamans, or chiefs believed to mediate between sky and earth. Their role was not simply meteorological. It was political. Rainmakers were not elected. They were chosen through lineage, apprenticeship, or initiation into secret societies. Their tools were ritual, chants, charms, drums, carved staffs, bowls of water, and offerings to spirits. Their task was not to explain weather, but to control it. To summon rain at the start of planting season. To hold back rain for funerals, markets, or journeys. To protect villages from destructive storms. Whether they truly influenced weather or not mattered less than the belief that they could. This belief structured communities, shaped politics, and distributed authority. A chief who controlled soldiers ruled bodies. A rainmaker who controlled weather ruled lives. It is tempting to see rainmaking as superstition, but closer attention reveals practical knowledge embedded in ritual. Rainmakers learned to read subtle environmental signs, the flight patterns of birds, the flowering of trees, the movements of insects, the smell of soil before a storm. They observed the sky in ways outsiders did not. Their predictions were wrapped in ritual, but their accuracy often exceeded chance. Thus, the ritual was less about fantasy and more about encoding ecological knowledge into social authority. Rainmaking rituals varied across the Congo Basin but often shared common elements. Invocation of ancestors. Rain was believed to be a gift from the spirits of the dead, mediated through the living. Libations of water or palm wine were poured into the earth to feed them. Symbolic objects. Rainmakers often carried staffs, gourds filled with sacred water, or charms made from animal parts. These objects were not mere props. They embodied the power of the sky. Performance, songs, dances, and drum rhythms accompanied rituals. The sound was believed to speak to the clouds, calling them closer. Sacrifice. Chickens, goats, or other animals were sometimes sacrificed, their blood mingling with earth to balance the forces of sky and soil. The rituals could last hours or days. Success brought celebration and tribute. Failure brought suspicion, even fear. Rainmakers walked a dangerous line. If rains came on time, they were honored, rewarded, sometimes feared. If rains failed, the community might blame them. Some rainmakers were accused of deliberately withholding rain for payment. Others were accused of witchcraft if storms came at the wrong time. In times of famine, a rainmaker might be killed or exiled. Thus, their power was never secure. It depended on constant performance and negotiation. In many Congo Basin kingdoms, rainmaking was tied directly to chiefly authority. Among the Luba and Lunda peoples, for example, rulers were believed to embody cosmic balance. If rain failed, it was a sign that the king had lost spiritual legitimacy. Chiefs might consult rainmakers to restore their power, or eliminate them if they threatened it. Thus, control of rain was also control of political legitimacy. In some areas, powerful chiefs claimed to be rainmakers themselves. Others kept rainmakers at court as advisors, priests, or ritual technicians. Either way, no ruler in the Congo Basin could ignore the sky. When European explorers, traders, and missionaries entered the Congo Basin in the 19th century, they were both fascinated and dismissive of rainmaking. Missionaries condemned it as pagan ritual. Traders sometimes paid rainmakers for favorable weather, hedging their disbelief. Yet colonial records reveal that rainmakers continued to wield significant influence well into the 20th century, shaping village politics and resisting colonial authority. To summon rain was to resist not just drought, but also the imposition of foreign control. At its core, rainmaking was not simply about weather. It was about the relationship between humans and the environment. The people of the Congo Basin lived in one of the richest, most fertile ecosystems in the world, and yet survival was precarious. Rain could bless or destroy. To make sense of this, societies developed systems of meaning that placed humans in dialogue with the sky. Rainmakers were not just technicians. They were philosophers of uncertainty. So here we pause, as thunder echoes across the canopy. If the rainmaker's role was both sacred and precarious, what happened when entire communities depended on them? And when colonial powers began to dismantle their authority? The rains have not come. The sky is pale and silent. Crops begin to wither. Children cry at night. And all eyes turn to one figure, the rainmaker. In this section, we explore how the authority of rainmakers shaped communities, how it intertwined with kingship and power, and how it endured, or faltered, under the weight of colonial disruption. In societies across the Congo Basin, rain was not only survival, it was legitimacy. Chiefs who failed to ensure rain lost respect. Villages that lacked access to a rainmaker faced famine. Thus, rainmakers often stood at the crossroads of politics and ecology. In some villages, the rainmaker acted as an independent authority outside of chiefdom hierarchies. In others, rainmaking power was integrated into kingship. A ruler might be expected to perform rain rituals himself or keep rainmakers as close advisors. This tension often created delicate relationships. A powerful rainmaker could threaten a chief's authority. Conversely, a chief who controlled a respected rainmaker's rituals could extend his influence across multiple villages. The balance of sky and earth was also a balance of power. Rainmakers often belonged to specialized lineages. Knowledge was passed from father to son or uncle to nephew through long apprenticeships. Initiates learned sacred chants, often in archaic or secret languages, techniques for reading signs in the sky, soil, and forest, the making of charms from herbs, minerals, and animal remains, the proper sequence of sacrifices and libations. This knowledge was guarded jealously. Outsiders rarely learned the full ritual cycle. Colonial ethnographers who tried to document rainmaking practices often found themselves frustrated. They described secrecy or evasiveness, but in truth, this secrecy was protective. To reveal rainmaking knowledge to outsiders would be to weaken its power. In practice, rainmaking was a kind of social contract. The rainmaker promised to protect the community from drought and floods. In return, the community supported the rainmaker with gifts of food, cloth, and prestige. If the rain came on time, all was well. If not, the rainmaker risked accusations. Perhaps he had withheld rain deliberately for more tribute. Perhaps he had been bribed by an enemy village to withhold rain. Perhaps his spiritual balance was corrupted, making him unfit for the task. The stakes were high. A failed rainmaker might be stripped of authority, exiled, or in extreme cases, killed. Thus, every storm carried political consequences. Accounts from the 19th century described diverse practices. Among some groups, rainmakers were said to stir water in gourds while chanting invocations, burn herbs whose smoke was believed to call the clouds, beat drums in rhythms associated with thunder, place sacred stones on hillsides to attract moisture, perform sacrifices of chickens, goats, or in rare ritual emergencies, more costly animals. In times of drought, entire communities might gather to participate, singing, dancing, and amplifying the ritual's force. The process was not merely meteorological. It was communal drama, reinforcing bonds of trust, dependence, and shared vulnerability. Rainmaking also extended beyond the village. Chiefs sometimes borrowed rainmakers from neighboring communities for crucial ceremonies. Rainmakers traveled as emissaries, their arrival a sign of alliance or negotiation. A marriage alliance might be sealed by a rainmaker's blessing. A peace treaty might require a joint rainmaking ritual, symbolizing shared fortune. A rebellion might be sparked if a ruler was accused of hoarding rainmaking power. Thus, the ability to control rain was also a form of diplomacy. The arrival of European colonial powers in the late 19th century profoundly disrupted rainmaking systems. Missionaries denounced rainmakers as sorcerers. Colonial officials dismissed them as frauds. Yet, paradoxically, some traders and explorers quietly sought out rainmakers before embarking on journeys, hoping for favorable weather. Colonial governments attempted to undermine their authority by criminalizing ritual practices, destroying sacred sites, and imposing European calendars and agricultural schedules. But this was not just cultural suppression. It was a direct attack on political autonomy. By discrediting rainmakers, colonizers sought to weaken local leadership structures and enforce dependence on colonial institutions. Still, rainmakers did not disappear. Many continued their work in secret, performing rituals away from colonial eyes. Others adapted, incorporating Christian symbols into their practices or rebranding their knowledge as medicine. In some cases, rainmakers even became symbols of resistance. Villages rallied around rainmakers who refused colonial control, believing they could protect crops from both drought and the violence of foreign soldiers. Some rainmakers blessed warriors, combining weather rituals with protective charms. For colonizers, these figures were threats, not because they truly controlled weather, but because they commanded loyalty that defied foreign rule. Yet the rainmaker's position was always precarious. Success reinforced power, failure invited doubt. Colonial suppression magnified this fragility, forcing rainmakers into secrecy or decline. Still, their memory persisted. Oral traditions across the Congo basin speak of legendary rainmakers who could summon storms with a gesture or stop rainfall mid-ceremony. Whether literal or symbolic, these stories remind us of the enduring association between weather and authority. And so we pause. If rainmakers once balanced ecology and politics, what happened to their legacy when the skies were no longer sacred, but subjects of science, maps, and meteorological stations? The rain falls now, not summoned, not delayed, but falling, as it always has, indifferent to human pleading. And yet, beneath the endless canopy of the Congo basin, the memory of those who once claimed to call the clouds still lingers. By the mid-20th century, colonial governments and missionaries had largely dismantled the formal authority of rainmakers. Meteorology stations, weather reports, and state agricultural programs redefined rainfall as a matter of science, not ritual. Children in schools learned about cloud formation and water cycles instead of chants and charms. Farmers were encouraged to follow colonial planting schedules rather than wait for ritual cues. Rainmaking, once central to political life, was relegated to the category of superstition. But to dismiss it so simply misses the deeper truth. Rainmaking was never only about weather. It was about trust, cohesion, and meaning. Even as formal authority declined, stories of rainmakers endured. Elders told of men who could summon storms with a wave of a staff. Songs remembered women who danced until thunder cracked open the sky. Proverbs reminded children that the one who mocks the rainmaker may still run for shelter when it falls. These tales function not as meteorology, but as cultural memory, reminders of a time when humans and skies were bound by ritual obligation. In this way, rainmakers lived on as ancestors of imagination, even when their rituals no longer commanded villages. Some rainmakers adapted by shifting their role from weather specialists to healers. The same knowledge of herbs, chants, and charms once used for rain rituals could be redirected to curing illness, easing childbirth, or protecting against misfortune. Thus, the rainmaker did not disappear, but transformed into the Nana, healer, diviner, spiritual guide. The sky may have slipped from their grasp, but the body and soul remained within reach. This adaptation ensured continuity. The knowledge of plants, rituals, and symbols survived, even if the focus changed. In oral histories recorded during independence movements of the mid-20th century, rainmakers sometimes reappear as symbols of resistance. In the 1950s, Congolese villagers invoked rainmakers in protests, claiming colonial rule had disrupted the balance of sky and earth. In Zambia, stories spread of leaders who could call storms against settlers. In Angola, fighters carried charms blessed by ritual specialists, echoing older rainmaking practices. Even when their literal authority waned, rainmakers remained figures of defiance, embodying a refusal to surrender cosmic order to foreign rule. Today, in many parts of the Congo basin, Rainmaking rituals are performed only in fragments, during cultural festivals, initiation rites, or local ceremonies of remembrance. They are not expected to work in the meteorological sense. Instead, they serve as heritage practices, linking communities to their ancestors. A rainmaker's staff might be carried in a parade. A chant might be performed before planting, even if farmers also check weather forecasts on their phones. Science and ritual coexist. The forecast predicts. The chant remembers. Ultimately, the rainmakers of the Congo Basin remind us of something profound, that humans need more than prediction. We need meaning. Rain was never just water. It was a blessing of ancestors, a test of leadership, a sign of balance between humans and nature. When the rain came, it affirmed the order of the world. When it did not, it demanded explanation, ritual, and reflection. Even today, in the age of satellites and climate models, we still speak of rain in ways that betray our longing for meaning. Merciful rain, angry skies, a blessing on the fields. In that sense, the rainmaker has not vanished. They live on in our language, in our metaphors, in our desire to believe that the sky listens. The Congo Basin rainmakers teach us that power need not be written, permanent, or visible to shape history. Their chants carved order into chaos. Their rituals gave people the courage to plant seeds in uncertain soil. Their authority balanced on the edge of thunder, fragile but enduring. And though their names are forgotten, their legacy lingers, in the rhythm of stories, in the persistence of ritual, in the very act of looking upward when clouds gather. So the question remains, when the rain falls today, do we see only water, or do we still hear the echo of drums calling the clouds? It is the year 1491. In the royal court of the Congo Kingdom, in what is now northern Angola and western Congo, a king receives strange visitors. They wear long robes, carry crosses, and speak of a distant ruler across the sea. They bring gifts, books, metal tools, and a new faith. The king, Nzinga Nkuwu, listens carefully. He knows the value of alliances, and he knows the power of trade. What follows is not simply curiosity. It is the beginning of a diplomatic experiment unlike any other in early modern Africa. Before Portuguese ships arrived, the Congo Kingdom was already a highly centralized state, stretching from the Atlantic coast to deep inland. Founded in the 14th century, its capital, Mbanza-Congo, sat on a plateau overlooking the plains. The kingdom had a well-structured hierarchy, the Mana-Congo, king, at the center. Provincial governors, appointed from noble families. Local chiefs, integrated into the system through tribute and allegiance. Trade already flowed across the kingdom. Copper, ivory, raffia cloth, and salt. Spiritual life revolved around ancestor veneration and sacred objects called nkisi, believed to mediate between humans and spirits. The Congo was not isolated. It was dynamic, organized, and ready to negotiate. When Portuguese explorers reached the Congo coast in the late 15th century, they came seeking gold, ivory, and access to trade routes. But they also brought something more enduring, diplomatic ambition. They wanted alliances, converts to Christianity, and influence. The Congo elite wanted access to firearms, luxury goods, and international prestige. This mutual interest created one of the earliest sustained diplomatic relationships between sub-Saharan Africa and Europe. In 1491, King Nzinga Nkuwu was baptized by Portuguese missionaries, taking the Christian name João I. His court followed suit. This was not simply a religious act. It was a diplomatic strategy. To be baptized was to enter into the symbolic world of European monarchies, to become a brother king to rulers in Lisbon and beyond. The king's son, Mvimba Nzinga, took this further. Baptized as Afonso I, he became one of the most remarkable rulers in African history. He not only embraced Christianity, but used it as a tool of governance, blending European symbols with Congo traditions. Afonso I's reign, 1509 to 1542, is particularly striking because he left behind something rare in African history, written correspondence. Dozens of his letters to Portuguese kings, the Pope in Rome, and other European figures survive. They cover topics as diverse as the regulation of the slave trade, the sending of Congo students to study in Portugal, complaints about Portuguese merchants undermining royal authority, requests for teachers, priests, and artisans. Through these letters, we see the Congo Kingdom as an active participant in global diplomacy, not a passive recipient of European influence. The Congo kings faced a constant balancing act, embracing Christianity, but on Congo terms, allowing Portuguese merchants, but trying to regulate them, sending ambassadors abroad, while asserting sovereignty at home. For example, Afonso I established Christian schools in Congo, but staffed them with both European and African teachers. He built churches, but also maintained traditional rituals. He sought firearms from Portugal, but resisted becoming a mere client state. The Congo court became a place where European envoys, African nobles, and priests debated politics, theology, and trade, a meeting ground of worlds. Diplomacy in Congo was not only written or spoken, it was also performed. When envoys arrived from Europe, they were received with elaborate processions, drumming, singing, and displays of regalia. Congo nobles wore both local raffia cloth and imported European silks. Christian crosses stood alongside traditional Nkisi charms. The blending of symbols was itself a form of diplomacy, signaling openness while affirming Congo's independence. Even art became diplomatic. Congo carvers produced crucifixes and Christian objects in distinctly African styles, showing both adoption and adaptation. But beneath the surface of this diplomatic exchange lurked a darker reality. The Portuguese were increasingly drawn to the Atlantic slave trade, and the Congo Kingdom became deeply entangled in it. At first, Afonso I tried to regulate the trade, insisting that only criminals or prisoners of war be sold. He even wrote letters to Portugal condemning the illegal kidnapping of his subjects by Portuguese merchants. But over time, the demand for slaves grew insatiable, and the kingdom itself fractured as local elites competed for control of the trade. Diplomacy and exploitation became intertwined. By the 17th century, the Congo Kingdom's diplomatic web began to fray. Relations with Portugal soured. Internal divisions deepened. European interest shifted toward direct colonial footholds. Yet, for over a century, the Congo Kingdom had managed something extraordinary. It stood as a sovereign partner in global diplomacy, exchanging ambassadors, letters, and symbols with the courts of Europe. It is a story not of isolation, but of entanglement. Not of domination, but of negotiation. So we pause here. If the Congo Kingdom built such a sophisticated diplomatic network, how did it unravel? And what happened to its rulers, who once wrote letters to kings across the sea? The royal court of Congo still shines with coral beads, crosses, and imported silks. Letters still flow across the sea, carrying the seal of the Manicongo to Lisbon and Rome. But the fabric of diplomacy is fraying. What began as alliance and mutual recognition is becoming entanglement and exploitation. King Afonso I, though celebrated as a Christian monarch, was deeply troubled by the slave trade. In his letters to Portugal, he complained bitterly of Portuguese merchants who bypassed royal authority, kidnapping free Congo citizens and selling them into slavery. In one famous letter of 1526, Afonso wrote, "Each day the traders are kidnapping our people, children of this country, sons of our nobles and vassals. This corruption is so great that our land is entirely depopulated." Here was a king pleading not as a subordinate, but as an equal, appealing for regulation, not abolition. He wanted the slave trade controlled by the crown, limited to criminals and prisoners of war. But Lisbon's merchants and crown officials saw profit, not principle. Their response was tepid, and the trade continued. The alliance with Portugal was both blessing and curse. Guns, Portuguese firearms gave the Congo army military advantage against rivals. Priests and teachers, missionaries helped establish schools, introducing literacy in Latin and Portuguese. Trade goods, imported cloth, wine, and metal-enriched elites. But each advantage carried costs. Firearms created dependency. Schools tied the kingdom to Portuguese influence. Trade goods undermined local industries. The very tools of diplomacy were also tools of subordination. The strain of the slave trade began to fracture the kingdom internally. Local nobles and provincial governors, tempted by wealth, bypassed royal authority and made direct deals with Portuguese merchants. This undermined the Manicongo's central power. What had been a unified system of tribute and hierarchy began to splinter. Provinces like Soyo asserted independence, fueled by profits from the trade. The web of diplomacy, once tightly woven around the king, loosened into strands pulled in many directions. Religion, too, became contested. Christianity had been embraced enthusiastically by Afonso I, but always adapted to Congo traditions. Crucifixes were carved in local styles. Saints were associated with African spirits. But Portuguese missionaries increasingly demanded orthodoxy, rejection of Nkisi charms, condemnation of syncretism, strict adherence to European Catholic practices. This created tension. Was Congo's Christianity truly its own, or was it subject to foreign control? Could the kingdom remain diplomatically Christian without losing its cultural sovereignty? The breaking point came in the 17th century. By this time, Portuguese Angola had grown powerful, and relations with Congo had soured. In 1665, Congo forces clashed with the Portuguese at the Battle of Mbuila. The man of Congo, Antonio I, personally led his troops. The result was catastrophic. Antonio was killed, his head sent to Lisbon as a trophy. This single battle shattered the kingdom's stability. Succession disputes, provincial rebellions, and Portuguese interference plunged Congo into civil war. The diplomatic web collapsed into conflict. For decades after Mbuila, the Congo kingdom was torn by rival claimants to the throne. Provinces like Soyo acted independently, sometimes even allying with the Dutch against Portugal. The once proud system of royal correspondence with Europe gave way to scattered appeals from fragmented factions. Diplomacy shifted from strength to desperation. Where once Congo rulers had written to the Pope as equals, now they begged European powers for aid, weapons, or recognition. The balance of sovereignty had tipped. And yet, even in decline, the idea of Congo as a Christian kingdom persisted. European writers continued to describe it as the Christian Empire of Africa. The memory of Afonso I's letters lingered. Diplomacy was not entirely lost. In the 18th century, Congo emissaries still traveled to Europe. Congo elites still maintained correspondence. The web was frayed, but not entirely broken. But here lies the paradox. The very thing that made Congo's diplomacy so remarkable, its written correspondence, also revealed its fragility. When letters were ignored, when treaties were broken, when battles were lost, the authority they carried dissolved. Unlike ritual or oral tradition, which could endure in memory, written diplomacy depended on foreign recognition. When that recognition waned, so too did its power. So here we pause. If the Congo kingdom once wrote to popes and kings as equals, how did it fall from correspondence to fragmentation? And what legacy did its diplomatic experiment leave for the centuries that followed? The year is 1700. The Congo kingdom is no longer the unified empire it once was. Civil wars rage. Rival claimants to the throne fight with Portuguese guns. Mbanza Congo, once the proud capital, lies abandoned for years at a time. And yet, across Europe, in dusty archives and chancery registers, letters from Congo kings remain. Testimony to a century of diplomacy that tried, and failed, to weave Africa into the European world on equal terms. In the beginning, the Congo kingdom had stood as a partner. Afonso I wrote to Lisbon and Rome as an equal sovereign, a Christian monarch in Africa. His words carried weight. His embassies were received with ceremony. His kingdom was admired as an example of conversion and statecraft. But as the centuries wore on, the balance shifted. Europe's hunger for slaves grew, and Congo became one of its primary suppliers. Diplomacy became less about partnership and more about control. Congo rulers who once sought recognition found themselves pleading for regulation. Their words, once diplomatic instruments, were increasingly ignored. The Battle of Mbuila in 1665 marked a turning point. The death of King Antonio I left the throne contested. For decades, rival factions fought for control, each claiming legitimacy, each appealing to Europeans for recognition. The diplomatic web that had once radiated outward from a single king now fragmented into strands, tangled and weakened. Foreign powers exploited these divisions, supporting one faction or another for their own interests. The very system of diplomacy that had once given Congo strength now became a tool of interference. Yet the letters remain. Today, Dozens of Afonso I's and later kings' letters survive in Portuguese and Vatican archives. They are extraordinary documents, appeals for justice against kidnappers, complaints about merchants undermining royal law, requests for artisans, teachers, and priests, statements of equality with European monarchs. These letters show that the Congo Kingdom was not a silent victim of European expansion. It was an active negotiator, seeking to shape its destiny through words and diplomacy. Even in decline, its kings continued to write, continued to assert sovereignty, continued to claim a place in the wider world. But the tragedy of Congo's diplomacy is its entanglement with the slave trade. The very system of correspondence and exchange that linked it to Europe also opened the door to exploitation. Some nobles enriched themselves by selling captives. Provinces rebelled, fueled by slave profits. The kingdom hollowed itself from within, even as it reached outward across oceans. Diplomacy, intended to bring equality, became bound to a system of inequality that consumed the kingdom itself. What remains of the Congo Kingdom's diplomatic web? Letters, a rare written record of African voices in the early modern period, challenging the stereotype of a voiceless continent. Memory, the story of Afonso I still circulates in Central African oral traditions, remembered as a Christian king who tried to balance two worlds. Symbols, Congo crucifixes and Christian art, blending African and European forms, stand as material evidence of cultural negotiation. Warning, a lesson in the fragility of diplomacy when power imbalances grow too great. The Congo Kingdom was not conquered in a single battle. It was undone by the slow unraveling of threads, trade, faith, politics, that once formed a resilient web. Stand in the ruins of Mbanza, Congo today. The town is quiet, yet echoes remain. Churches built of stone, local traditions of memory, and a deep pride in the kingdom that once stood as a world power. The story of Congo diplomacy is not just African history. It is global history, a reminder that the world was connected long before colonial empires, and that African rulers once wrote directly to popes, kings, and emperors, demanding recognition. And so we ask, when letters are written but not answered, does diplomacy die, or does it live on in the archives, waiting for history to read them again? The sun rises over the highlands of the Mweda Plateau. Mist clings to the forests, where the cries of birds echo in the cool air. In a small clearing, a man sits before a tusk of ivory. His hands are steady, his tools simple. Chisels of iron, sharpened knives, and patience measured not in hours but in seasons. He is a Makan carver. The ivory before him will not be a mere ornament. It will become a story in sculpture, a fragment of history preserved in smooth, pale lines. The Makan people, spread across what is now Mozambique and Tanzania, lived for centuries in scattered villages on rugged plateaus and forest margins. Life was shaped by subsistence farming, hunting, and small-scale trade. But in the 16th century, they found themselves at the crossroads of new global forces. The Indian Ocean Trade Network, stretching from the Swahili coast to Arabia, India, and Europe, began to demand ivory on an unprecedented scale. Elephant tusks became more than resources. They became currency, tribute, and symbols of power. The Makand, skilled in carving wood for masks and ritual objects, turned their artistry toward ivory. Ivory had long been valued in Africa, but in Makand lands it acquired special meaning. A tusk could be a tribute offered to chiefs or coastal traders, a medium of exchange, traded for beads, cloth, or metal tools, a symbol of status, displayed in rituals or burials. But when carved, ivory transcended mere trade. It became a visual language. Makan sculptors carved scenes of daily life, hunters, dancers, mothers with children, symbols of authority, chiefs, warriors, ritual leaders. Spirals of interconnected figures, representing community and ancestry. Each carving was both art and record, a way of preserving memory in material form. One of the most distinctive Makand ivory forms was the Ujamaa style, a spiral column of human figures climbing upon one another, often carved from a single tusk. Each figure represented a role: the hunter, the farmer, the mother, the child, the elder, the drummer. Together, they symbolized the interdependence of society. For the Makand, Individuality did not exist apart from community. To carve people climbing upon one another was to show the truth of life, that survival required cooperation, lineage, and mutual support. These carvings were not just decorative. They were moral lessons, encoded in ivory. By the 17th century, Makonde ivory carvings were increasingly exported through the Swahili coast. Portuguese, Arab, and Indian merchants carried them across oceans, where they appeared in European cabinets of curiosity and Indian princely courts. But their meaning at home remained spiritual. Ivory masks were worn in initiation ceremonies, linking young men to the ancestors. Figurines were placed in shrines, honoring spirits and protecting villages. Carved tusks stood as status symbols, linking chiefs to elephants' power and abundance. Thus, ivory operated on two levels: sacred at home, valuable abroad. Behind the beauty of ivory lay the violence of elephant hunting. Makonde hunters risked their lives to track, spear, and kill elephants, whose size and strength made the task dangerous. The elephant itself was revered as a spiritual being. To kill one required ritual purification. Parts of the animal, tusks, hide, hair, were divided carefully according to tradition. For carvers, ivory was not just material. It was the bone of a powerful spirit. To carve it was to engage in dialogue with that spirit, to transform raw power into form and meaning. When European missionaries reached Makonde lands in the 19th century, they were astonished by the intricacy of Makonde ivory and wood carvings. They often dismissed local spiritual meanings as pagan, but eagerly collected carvings as art. Ivory sculptures found their way into European museums and private collections, admired for their craft but stripped of their context. A spiral of figures might be labeled simply tribal art, without recognition that it was a philosophy in miniature. This disconnection reveals a familiar pattern: African art reduced to object, while its history and meaning were ignored. For the Makonde themselves, ivory carving was always about memory. In a world where history was transmitted orally, carvings became anchors for stories. A figure of a drummer evoked songs. A spiral of farmers recalled planting seasons. A mother with a child preserved generational continuity. These objects were not written archives, but sculpted archives. In this way, the ivory sculptors of Makonde were historians, not with ink, but with chisel. So we pause here. If ivory carvings carried memory, what happens when those carvings are taken, traded, and displayed far from their homeland? Do they still speak, or do they fall silent in foreign hands? The tusk has been carved. Figures climb in spirals, hunters hold spears, mothers cradle children, and elders sit in watchful silence. The carver steps back. For him, this is history in form, a story preserved. But soon, traders from the coast arrive. They see not a narrative, but a commodity. The tusk is lifted, wrapped, and carried away. By the time it reaches the sea, it will no longer be a family's archive, but a merchant's profit. By the 16th century, ivory from East Africa was a central commodity in the Indian Ocean trade network. In India, ivory was carved into inlays for furniture and palace doors. In the Middle East, it was used for prayer beads and luxury boxes. In Europe, it became crucifixes, rosaries, and ornaments for cabinets of curiosity. Makonde ivory joined this circulation. Carvings left the plateau, passed through Swahili merchants, and entered distant worlds where their original meanings were forgotten. The spiral of figures, once read as a lesson of community, was admired only for its technical brilliance. Swahili traders, operating from towns like Kilwa and Zanzibar, were the key brokers of Makonde ivory. They exchanged cloth, beads, and metal goods for tusks and carvings, then exported them across the ocean. These traders often demanded carvings tailored to foreign tastes. Crucifixes, saints, and even European coats of arms began to appear in Makonde ivory, not as signs of conversion, but as adaptations for trade. Thus, Makonde sculptors became both historians of their people and craftsmen for distant buyers. Their work straddled two worlds, the sacred and the commercial. Ivory was valuable, but its value drew violence. Hunters risked their lives killing elephants, whose strength could crush or gore. Raids for tusks sometimes sparked wars between villages. Caravans carrying ivory were frequent targets for bandits. Each carved tusk bore silent testimony to both artistry and danger. When Europeans admired an ivory crucifix in Lisbon or Venice, they rarely considered the chain of labor, risk, and blood that brought it there. By the 19th century, as European colonial powers expanded into East Africa, ivory carving became further commodified. Colonial officials and missionaries purchased Makand carvings, often at low prices, sometimes confiscating them as pagan objects. Many were shipped to European museums, stripped of context, catalogued as ethnographic specimens. The carvers themselves became curiosities, photographed, studied, but rarely credited as individual artists. Ivory spirals that once symbolized community survival were displayed behind glass, their meanings unreadable to foreign eyes. Yet, even as their works left home, the Makand carvers continued to produce for local use. Masks for initiation rites, small figurines for shrines, staffs for elders. These remained central to Makand identity. Carving was not abandoned. It adapted. In fact, the dual role of carving, one for trade, one for ritual, ensured its survival. Even as colonial disruption deepened, Makand sculptors held on to their identity through their tools and craft. At the heart of Makand ivory carving was always the philosophy of interdependence. The spiral of figures was more than artistic flourish. It was a worldview. No hunter without the farmer. No elder without the child. No leader without the people climbing beneath him. This philosophy gave strength to Makand communities, even as external pressures mounted. The carvings were quiet teachers, reminding all who looked that survival came not through isolation, but through cooperation. But what happens when such a carving, loaded with meaning, is taken to Europe or India? Does it still speak? For foreign collectors, the spiral became decoration. The hunter became anonymous, the mother became generic, the elder became irrelevant. The carving's meaning was muted, but not erased. For the Makand, the memory of what these objects once meant lingered, even when the objects themselves were far away. Thus, the ivory carried two histories, one visible in European museums, another whispered in Makand villages. So we pause. If ivory carvings were both memory and commodity, what became of them when colonialism deepened, elephants dwindled, and the trade shifted to new forms of exploitation? The tusk is gone now. Carried on a caravan's back, sold at a coastal market, shipped across seas. But the Makand sculptor remains, chiseling in wood, ivory, or whatever material remains at hand. His art has always been more than trade. It is survival. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, elephant populations across East Africa plummeted under the pressure of global demand. Colonial hunters, traders, and companies harvested tusks at industrial scale. The ivory trade, once sustained by small-scale hunting and ritualized distribution, became violent extraction. The Makand were caught between supplying ivory for colonial markets and protecting their communities from its destabilizing effects. As ivory became scarcer and colonial restrictions grew harsher, Makand sculptors turned increasingly to wood as their medium. This shift did not erase the old forms. Instead, the philosophy of spiraling figures and interdependence moved from tusk to timber. The Ujamaa style survived, no longer carved in ivory, but in ebony, mahogany, and soft local woods. Many Makand ivory carvings collected in the 19th century now sit in European museums, in Berlin, Lisbon, London, Paris. They are admired as tribal art, studied for their aesthetic qualities, but often stripped of their context. A spiral of figures becomes a decorative column. A mother and child becomes a primitive fertility symbol. A drummer becomes an exotic curiosity. The voices of the carvers, their proverbs, their philosophies, are rarely heard in these displays. The carvings, once archives of community life, became silent in foreign hands. Yet the Makand did not lose their art. In the 20th century, especially under colonial rule in Mozambique and Tanzania, Makand sculptors began to innovate. They created the famous Shetani carvings, fluid, abstract forms representing spirits, often with distorted faces and elongated limbs. These works blended tradition with experimentation, attracting attention from collectors and becoming symbols of Makand identity. The old ivory spirals lived on in wood carvings of Ujamaa, sometimes several feet tall, representing family and community. Tourists bought them, but for the Makand, they also remained lessons in interdependence. Thus, the sculptors adapted. They carved against silence, ensuring their history was never fully erased. Today, ivory carving is rare, both because of international bans and because of the recognition of elephants as endangered. But surviving Makand ivory pieces remain treasured, not only for their beauty, but as fragments of cultural memory. They remind us that objects can hold philosophy, that a spiral of figures was not just an ornament, but a vision of society. That carving could be both trade and testimony. For the Makand, these objects are not curiosities. They are ancestors in ivory. So what do the Makand ivory sculptors teach us? They teach us that art is not separate from survival, that objects can be archives, that even when taken, traded, or displayed without context, they still carry whispers of their origin. Stand before a Makand spiral today, in a museum far from its homeland. Look at the figures climbing upon one another. The hunter, the farmer, the mother, the elder. They are still there, bound together, telling the truth the sculptors always knew, that no one stands alone, that every life depends on another, that memory can be carved, even in silence. And so we ask, when art is taken from its people, does it lose its meaning, or does it wait patiently, like ivory under the chisel, for someone to listen again? The desert sun is relentless. Sand drifts across courtyards, and the air is dry as parchment. Yet in the heart of Timbuktu, a city famed for its libraries and scholars, time once flowed not only in the stars above, but in drops of water falling through hidden vessels. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Timbuktu had become one of the greatest centers of learning in Africa. Situated on the edge of the Sahara, along the Niger River, it thrived as a hub of trade, scholarship, and religion under the Mali and later the Songhai Empire. Its mosques, Sankore, Jingareber, and Sidi Yahya, were not just places of worship but universities, where scholars debated theology, astronomy, medicine, and law. Here, time mattered. Not only the time of day, but the time of prayer, the time of trade, the time of study. And so, scholars sought ways to measure it with accuracy. The concept of the water clock was not new. Known as clepsydras in the ancient world, they had been used in Egypt, Greece, and the Islamic Middle East for centuries. By the time Timbuktu flourished, Islamic scholars had already adapted water clocks to measure prayer times and astronomical events. But Timbuktu's water clocks remain mysterious. No surviving physical examples have been found. Instead, they are remembered through oral histories and scattered references in manuscripts. They are described as devices that measured hours by the steady dripping of water, sometimes enhanced with floats, pulleys, or markings that indicated the passage of time. In a desert city where water was precious, to measure time with it was both practical and symbolic. Time itself was a resource, flowing drop by drop. Islamic practice requires daily prayers at specific times: dawn, noon, afternoon, sunset, and evening. In Timbuktu, as in other Muslim centers, accurate timekeeping was essential for religious life. Traditionally, prayer times could be estimated by the position of the sun and shadows. But water clocks allowed for greater precision, especially on cloudy days or at night. Scholars at Sankore Mosque may have used these clocks to announce prayer times, ensuring that the rhythm of worship matched the rhythm of flowing water. Thus, time was not only a measure of hours, but of devotion. In a desert environment, water is life. To use it as a measure of time was profoundly symbolic. Each drop was both fleeting and eternal, both necessary and expendable. For Timbuktu's people, the slow drip of a clock was not merely mechanical. It was spiritual. It reminded them that life itself flowed away drop by drop, that time was not infinite, that every moment had weight. A water clock in Timbuktu was not just an instrument. It was a philosophy. Why are Timbuktu's water clocks lost? The answer lies in fragility. Unlike stone mosques or written manuscripts, water clocks were made of wood, clay, and metal, materials that decay in desert climates. As political upheaval struck Timbuktu, Moroccan invasions in the late 16th century, colonial interventions centuries later, fragile devices like clocks were not preserved. Manuscripts mention them, elders remember them, but the objects themselves are gone. Their absence leaves us with haunting questions. How accurate were they? What did they look like? Were they simple bowls or elaborate machines with gears and dials? Imagine walking through Timbuktu in the 15th century. In the marketplace, traders argue over prices of salt and gold. In the mosque, scholars debate law. Outside, a muezzin calls the faithful to prayer. And somewhere in a shaded courtyard, a vessel of water drips, marking the hours silently. In a city where knowledge was prized, the water clock was both tool and teacher. It taught that time was not infinite, that every drop counted, that life itself was a flow that could not be reversed. So we pause here. If the water clocks of Timbuktu are lost, what does it mean for history when memory flows away like water? Can the rhythm of time be preserved without its instruments? The library doors open. Inside, the air is cooler, thick with the smell of parchment, leather, and ink. Stacks of manuscripts line the shelves, treatises on astronomy, medicine, law, poetry. Here, scholars of Timbuktu debated not only the will of God, but the measurement of his creation, time. And in the corner of this intellectual world, a humble tool once dripped steadily, marking the rhythm of hours, the water clock. The scholars of Timbuktu were not isolated from the wider Islamic world. They studied texts from Cairo, Fez, and Baghdad, many of which included instructions on timekeeping. Astronomy was particularly important. Knowing the movement of stars and the sun allowed scholars to calculate prayer times, Ramadan fasting hours, and the lunar calendar. Water clocks complemented this system. Where astronomy required clear skies, the water clock provided consistency, a quiet, reliable measure, even when clouds or dust storms hid the heavens. Together, they formed a double system, the cosmic clock of the stars and the earthly clock of water. Scattered references to water clocks appear in Timbuktu's surviving manuscripts. They describe simple bowls with holes at the bottom, sinking gradually as water escaped. More complex devices with floats attached to rods, rising and falling with the water level. Notes on calibrating the clocks to match daylight hours, adjusting for seasonal changes. Some manuscripts even contain drawings, though fragmentary, of these devices, circles and lines suggesting bowls, markers, and dripping mechanisms. Though incomplete, these references confirm that Timbuktu scholars were not only familiar with water clocks, but actively used and adapted them. In Timbuktu, to measure time was more than practicality. It was a sign of learning and legitimacy. A scholar who could explain the stars, regulate prayer, and keep hours was respected. A ruler who patronized such knowledge enhanced his authority. Thus, water clocks became associated with intellectual prestige. They were part of a broader scholarly culture that valued calculation, order, and mastery over the unseen rhythms of the world. Unlike manuscripts, which could be copied and preserved, water clocks required constant maintenance. The wood warped in dry air, the clay cracked in heat, the metal corroded, and above all, they needed water, always scarce in the desert. Thus, many water clocks were likely short-lived, replaced or repaired season by season. Their disappearance is not surprising. What is surprising is how deeply they lingered in memory. Oral traditions recall them long after the devices themselves were gone, suggesting that they held symbolic weight far beyond their practical function. In 1591, the Moroccan army invaded Timbuktu, defeating the Songhai Empire and seizing control of the city. Many scholars were killed, exiled, or taken to Morocco. This disruption shattered Timbuktu's scholarly networks. Libraries were scattered, institutions weakened, and many fragile tools, including water clocks, likely destroyed or abandoned. In the centuries that followed, under colonial rule and economic decline, the city's libraries survived precariously. But the water clocks vanished entirely. For Timbuktu's scholars, water itself was a metaphor for knowledge. Manuscripts describe learning as a river that flows through generations, sometimes drying up, sometimes flooding, but always present. To measure time with water was thus doubly symbolic. It united the flow of knowledge with the flow of hours, reminding scholars that both were fragile, both required care, and both could vanish if neglected. Imagine a student in Sankor Mosque studying law or astronomy. As he debates with his teacher, the drip of a water clock continues in the background. He looks up, sees the level has dropped, and knows an hour has passed. That drop of water is not only time, but discipline. It reminds him that learning requires patience, that life is fleeting, that moments must be treasured. The clock teaches not with words, but with silence. So we pause. If manuscripts preserve the ideas of Timbuktu's scholars, but the water clocks are lost, what part of their knowledge vanished with them? How much of history flows away when its instruments decay? The courtyard is silent now. The manuscripts remain. The mosques still stand. But the drip of water that once measured the hours has vanished. No vessels, no floats, no rods. The clocks of Timbuktu are gone. And yet, their absence speaks. Fragile instruments rarely survive history. Wood rots, clay cracks, metal corrodes. But ideas, carried in manuscripts and memories, endure. Timbuktu's water clocks may be lost as objects, but they survive as ideas recorded in writing and remembered in tradition. Scholars wrote of them, travelers mentioned them, and oral traditions passed down their existence. What remains is not the thing itself, but the thought it carried, that time could be measured, ordered, and sanctified. In Timbuktu, time was not abstract. It was woven into daily practice, the rhythm of prayers, the timing of markets, the hours of teaching in mosques, the calculation of fasting and feasts. The water clock brought discipline into this rhythm. It gave structure to study and certainty to devotion. Each drop of water was a reminder that time flowed, quietly, steadily, beyond human control. Even when the clocks disappeared, that philosophy remained embedded in scholarly life. When European colonial powers reached Timbuktu in the 19th century, they marveled at the city's manuscripts but paid little attention to fragile instruments. Water clocks, if any remained, were dismissed as curiosities or ignored entirely. This neglect reflects a broader pattern. African knowledge was admired in the abstract but rarely valued in its material forms. The manuscripts survived by chance, hidden in families' trunks and libraries. The clocks, lacking such protection, vanished. Their silence today is a reminder of how easily history can be erased, not by malice alone, but by indifference. Yet the symbolism of the water clock endures. In Timbuktu, where rain is rare and water precious, to measure time with water was to acknowledge fragility. Every drop was valuable. Every drop could vanish. Life itself was measured in the flow of a substance that sustained it. In this sense, the water clocks were not only scientific tools, but philosophical teachers. They embodied the truth that time, like water, must be cherished, managed, and never taken for granted. Today, scholars studying Timbuktu's manuscripts continue to uncover references to water clocks, often buried in treatises on astronomy or religious law. Efforts to reconstruct them, even hypothetically, remind us of the ingenuity of Timbuktu's scholars. Meanwhile, the city itself, though battered by conflict and neglect, still treasures its heritage. Festivals, lectures, and preservation projects keep alive the memory of its libraries, and, indirectly, the memory of the clocks that once ticked beside them. The water clocks may never be rebuilt, but their idea, that time flows, silently and inevitably, remains as relevant today as ever. Stand in Timbuktu today. The desert wind moves sand across the courtyards where scholars once debated. The mosques still call to prayer, as they have for centuries. And though no water clock drips in the corner, you can imagine it, steady drops marking steady hours, teaching patience, discipline, and humility. The clocks are gone, but the rhythm remains, in the prayers, in the markets, in the manuscripts, in memory. And so we ask, when history's objects vanish, do their ideas vanish with them? Or do they live on in silence?